We were planning to go over the background and the goals and the outline. I don't know how much we want to do that, given I think Joe is the only person who hasn't um, been in the prior meetings. So just as a quick overview, Joe, this is the first American meeting for the International Society of Clinical Eye Tracking.
Hmm.
We've had a few meetings so far with time zones shifted dramatically relative to this. So the goal for today was to get in some American uh, people to join. But overall, the idea of the group is we had a previous group of researchers who did some guidelines for eye tracking in general, and
Hmm.
particularly reporting eye tracking measures in papers. Um, and some of the clinical members of that group expressed the need for specifically clinical guidance, right? So if you're using eye tracking in any clinical capacity, there's a lack of guidelines available. Um, so this group was formed in order to develop some guidance along those lines. Um,
Right.
uh, Ruth, I know you were planning to speak for a bit about how the previous society acts as a model for this. I don't know if you want to. I don't know. I want to make good use of your time also. Um,
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And I am happy to do a really quick resume, but I'm aware that lots of people in this call have kind of heard me say this stuff before. Um, so I'll make it a whistle stop tour. And, if you've heard it before, check your emails. I get it. So the point about this was whether or not the electrophysiology, visual electrophysiology society and the way we were set up and what we do might serve as a reasonable template for this nascent eye tracking international society. ISEF is small as well. We're about 300 members worldwide, founded in 1958. And I think probably came about because of conversations very, very similar to the conversations that are going on here, not by Zoom in 1958, of course, but similar thing. And back in those days, most of the ERGs that were happening, because we were founded as a society that ERGs, weren't really happening in research labs and not an awful lot happening clinically. So the purpose of founding it was as a clinical society. We have the C in our name and have retained it because it was about how can we make these effectively research tools actually useful in clinic. So we were founded with all these great aims, one of which was to develop standardized tests. And that took a long time to come about. It was the 1980s, actually, before it first came about. For lots of all the complicated reasons that you can think of. Everybody did it differently. It was very hard to just actually create a mechanism to write a clinical standard and so on. And the retinitis pigmentosa as a disorder was the trigger for actually developing our first standard. Writing standards are core to our business. And there was a partnership with the RP Society and ISEF, and we hammered it out with a group of just 5 or 6 individuals, came up with the first draft, and then it cycled round and became our first standard, published in the 1980s. We've now got 5 of them, so we do VPs and others, and actually we're expanding our scope into other psychophysical tests in partnership with other societies. It makes good sense to do that, partly because we have our own journal, so we can publish clinical standards and guidelines without going through a peer review process, because they are published effectively via a peer review process. And I don't need to tell this audience why standards are so good, but just basically they're very helpful for patients. They highly standardized tests. They create a way of doing something that starts off being complicated, but ends up being both relatively easy to perform and to interpret. And that immediately spreads the expertise. And this is the analogy I use. Imagine a pool of patients or individuals out there in the world right now who would benefit from having their eye movements assessed clinically. And of that pool, how many now can go and get that test done? And I imagine it's a very, very small fraction. So I guess the aim would be let's spread the pool so that this becomes something that's available much more widely. And that's what standardization of tests does, as well as the other wins. Makes life easier for your manufacturers because you create what's effectively an industry standard, and that helps them with all their device development, regulatory issues. And for research, you've got a clinical standard that's agreed internationally. That's great news for people like the FDA, European Medicines Association, and your tests can start to become clinical endpoints and trials, which again is just expanding their utility more widely. Worth mentioning that the way that we develop our standards are we have a board, the board appoints a committee. Committee is designed to have suitable expertise and suitable geographic breadth. They produce a draft, and that gets scrutinized in cycles by the membership. Membership comments are taken on board and or ignored sometimes, depends what they are. And the final version gets approved by a vote of the membership, and we then publish it in our own journal. Really worth emphasizing, I suppose, that it's a difficult thing to do because centres have their own way of doing things. And if the standard deviates from that, there's opposition, there's resistance, it can be really controversial actually and difficult. So it's worth being really clear that in all of our standards, what they do is define a minimum. So it's a bare minimum. It's like the core centre bit of your test. And as they always have been, every centre is absolutely free to do extensions to that, adaptations of that, whatever else they want to do. We're just aiming to have this core central bit, which is common and therefore applicable. So it's like your passport. You know, you can get an ERG done, and it's the same in Albuquerque as it is in Aberdeen, as it is in Auckland. Managed to stay with my A's there. So that's the prize, I guess, if this nascent ISCET is able to develop clinical guidelines and standards.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, so that's the overall goal we have here is to do the equivalent, right? But in the eye tracking domain. But our biggest priorities at the moment, one of them, as Matt mentioned, is going to be getting more people from the Americas to join on. But another related item is one of our first priorities is to get a clear sense of what the current eye tracker usage is internationally in clinical terms. And so the way that we were planning to approach that so far has been we're expecting to do a survey of various societies. And so at the moment, we're trying to identify what societies should be contacted. And I'm going to post a link in the chat to this real quick. So that's a link to a shared Google document that anyone can add to with questions that we want to ask the different groups, and also just a list of potential groups to contact. And you'll note, if you look at it, it's primarily UK-based groups identified so far because that's been where we had the largest contributions for these meetings. So if any of you can think of other potential clinical bodies to approach, it would be great if you could add that to the list. And if you have any ideas for how we should reach out to people more to get more, especially clinicians, interested in joining this group, that would be good. So we were hoping today to come up with some agreement on how big the survey would be and that kind of thing, but I don't know that we want to do that given the size. I think our priority today might want to be expanding this group more first, because we don't have a strong initial sense for. I feel like we're missing stakeholders here, basically.
Well, is this mostly? I joined late, but is this mostly researchers or clinicians there? And the few names that I recognize look like researchers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
That's,
mostly researchers, which again is I think we shouldn't be from that alone deciding on any major path of things. But that's also part of, I think, why it's been a little more challenging to identify the relevant clinical groups or advertising outlets, right? Because I know for me, my clinical eye tracking connections are relatively limited. Matt, you were raising your hand.
Oh, I think Ruth was before me, actually. I'll let
Sure, Ruth.
No, Matt, you were before me, actually. I saw your hand go
Oh,
up.
okay. So I was just going to add an extra point because Gemma Arblaster, who had taken on the burden of getting the ethical approval for this survey, or so far as I looked into it, one of the things which she discussed with me offline was about whether we would be surveying the professional bodies themselves and asking for responses from, they would represent their members, or whether you would ask each professional body to then send out a survey to their members. Now, obviously, again, there's only 9 of us here today, so it's probably maybe not the best time to be making too many decisions. However, it may be something we might want to discuss as well. The way I see it, obviously, if you can get the members to respond, then that's a greater representation. But on the other hand, it might be very difficult in terms of each individual professional body might have different rules around how you would even be able to contact those people and so on. So that was one thing that might be worth just discussing in relation to that survey.
That would also presumably be a much larger data set to deal with.
Well, one concern I would have about that is that if you have, say, one professional body that just sort of doesn't really send it out very well, then you don't get equal representation from each of those different societies. But that was just my thinking on that.
Yeah. I mean, that's also a problem we have to keep in mind in terms of just identifying professional bodies in the first place, right? So we want to make sure that there's a good representation around. On that note, I believe the last thing I saw from Gemma said, assuming it's still considered worthwhile by the group. So I don't know that she has actually taken any steps yet. You might have a better idea.
Not yet. No, she's just looked into it and the feasibility of it. And I think the question before was, do we even need ethical approval to poll these bodies? But I think if it's going to be done as a kind of a foundational paper for the basis of what we then prioritize as standards, the whole purpose of this is which clinical disciplines are most in need of guidance, and so that that's why this is happening in the first place. Then it may require ethics approval. So that's very early stages.
I think we landed on yes, we probably need approval.
Yeah.
Ruth, you had your hand.
I wonder if oh, I'm sorry, I forgot.
It's okay, Stephen, that's fine. So Stephen, do you want to fire in first, because I've got 3 points?
Yeah, okay. So maybe contacting some of the researchers in our field that are also clinicians, and they do a lot of clinical research. So Jorge would know several of those people, I think. David Z, certainly. Reza, Jorge, I'm thinking. Maybe other people at Johns Hopkins. The entire pedigree of people trained by John Lee would be people interested in this. And they would know all the societies too. I mean, we'd only need a few of those people to know all the societies would be relevant to harvesting. And they also might have opinions about the clinicians in those fields, about how to best approach them. So one of the things that we work on is eye movements in radiologists, and it's been invaluable to have as a primary member of the lead team in our research an actual full-time radiologist, because he knows a lot about the community and about the collective zeitgeist and kind of way they do things. And it's helped us navigate the minefield of that community and to find the best ways to communicate with those communities, to recruit subjects, and to get data from them and things like that. It's actually, we would have blundered into it and just screwed it all up if it hadn't been for his kind of advice as a clinician. So maybe we could put together an email or something to send to researchers in integrative, visual processing, and might have some ideas about that. Maybe Jorge can refine this even more, and that's a better idea since he's more in that field.
Yeah, I think that would be good for sure. And you're right. If the researchers in the group start just arbitrarily deciding guidelines based on what makes sense to us. Obviously, we're going to miss some important clinical ramifications or another. Yeah.
Luis, do you have contact info for John Lee? I graduated his lab almost 30 years ago, and I've lost touch with him since he left Cleveland.
Well,
So,
I do.
you do?
Yeah.
You're in touch with him?
Yeah, sometimes. More with Z,
Okay.
but still with John Lee sometimes.
Hmm. You know what? Could you put his contact in the chat? I'll pull it out of there.
Okay, Robert, shall I
Yeah.
come in?
Yep.
Great. So there was, I mean, first of all, I'm a clinician. I work full time in the NHS, and eye movement research is a very small part of my research stuff. And I think by necessity, you're going to have a really high preponderance of researchers at the start of this endeavor, although reaching out to the full, I guess when you say clinicians, I don't know if you mean doctors or people who are working full time in a clinical setting. That's really important. In the US, and not just in the US, elsewhere, a really big issue is whether or not clinicians get reimbursed for the tests. So that's just the way life is, isn't it? And that's no one's going to devote hours and hours of their life and time to bringing into being a set of standardized tests if they're never going to get paid for doing them on their patients. So it's a really important consideration in people working in healthcare settings that have got different financial models than the UK or other places. But what I wanted to do is be a bit more positive that actually.
Can I follow up on that with a quick question? So are you saying that what we need to do from the get-go is figure out how to assign codes to each of these tests?
Oh heavens, I think you're probably quite a long way away from that, but having that in your mind from the outset would be really useful. Really useful. I mean, to state that as one of the aims in your first set of bylaws, you know, that you want to develop clinical tests that are chargeable where that's relevant.
You're right.
Because
It has to be in the first paragraph of any email we
You're going
send.
to bring so many people on side with having that as a stated aim and something that you're actually addressing every time you come back to your meetings. And then just another, sorry, Robert.
No, just that's a good point. And I agree with Steve. It would make sense to include that directly in the advertisements. Yeah.
Yeah, so if can I make a comment on that? Like, I think it's also important to think that for clinical, there are companies producing software that will produce canned turn-on tests.
Right.
So a lot of papers are based on whatever that device they use outputs things for that test. And different vendors will output things differently. So this has the component of sometimes being limited by whatever the industry reports
and
for
I guess,
that particular test.
Yeah.
So you're so correct there. And I guess what you want to do here is not allow, that's the wrong terminology. If that continues to happen, and it will, because there's a new one every week, if industries are developing their own versions of tests, they're going to use the normal commercial process to see who comes out top dog, sells the most of them, then it becomes an industry standard, and your chance of influencing it with your clinical understanding and knowledge becomes less and less. Whereas if right at the outset, as part of the contact group, you have all the manufacturers that are producing eye tracing of any kind that's going to be relevant clinically also on board and attending the meetings and engaged with the society and its aims, then it's much more likely that you'll develop a better outcome that actually suits the clinical need. And then just to finish in terms of practicalities, I just have a suggestion that as immediately as you can, form a nascent board. Just appoint members. There's no point in holding elections this early doors. Just appoint people with really short terms so it's transparent. Set up a list of 3-4 aims. Set up tasks like, Mario made a really good point that online we're invisible. So get your comms officer on there. Your job is to make us visible, to get a Twitter account, start firing out ideas so that people gradually start hearing about you as an entity. And you're already doing something, you already exist. And then you may soon get to the point where you can attract membership, and with that comes a little bit of money just through small membership fees, and that then allows you to do more. That was what I was suggesting might accelerate things a bit more.
Do you think we should do that maybe through the discussion list, the email list that we have? Because that way people from whichever region could become involved. I don't know if that makes the most sense, or just asking for volunteers at the meetings.
So I know Matt's got something to say. So I would imagine if you ask for volunteers, you'll be met with a resounding silence.
Right.
Whereas
that
if
is
you
fair.
identify
Yeah.
3 or 4 key roles, maybe 4 or 5 key roles, and you specifically approach individuals and say, please, would you take this on just for 6 months?
Yeah.
And then we're going to
Yeah.
revise it, and we'll say that that's just for 6 months, and then we'll find someone else. And each person is then responsible for nominating their successor in the first
Right.
instance, up until such time that you're ready with a membership to actually elect these positions. I think that maybe starting that way might be helpful.
I think to get started, I suggest that that maybe we appoint some of these younger faculty here to that. And the reason is because I think those titles for them could have the largest impact on their careers and promotions than for us older people. But later, when it's election time, it's going to be less likely for younger people to have the opportunity to be whatever of, some high office in the society. At least that's how it generally works. So let's take advantage now for people to appoint people who are going to really benefit from this, and also are hungry to have this, new opportunities.
Yeah. But before we do that, Matt, you had your hand raised a while ago. I don't want to.
All right, it was just in response to something that Ruth said before, which was about the importance of getting manufacturers on board. In fact, we have actually had quite a lot of interest so far. We had CRS have been at one of the meetings. Bobby Tech have all signed up. I know we had an SR representative as well when we were in the Europe side. We don't have anybody from an eye tracking manufacturer here today, unfortunately, but we have had that before. So I know that they're listening. Yeah.
Let's get Bo Watson on here from Apple, because that Vision Plus device is, I tried to dig it out of him if this is going to just replace all the eye tracking devices, and he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And Apple absorbed SMI and a couple other really high quality eye tracking companies, and Bo's been leading them on building that specific device that's about to come out. It's got something like 5 eye trackers in it. And I think it's likely going to become a consumer level eye tracking device, and this society should be in a position to understand it and also feed information about things we want to see to Apple, right? So getting, he would be a key player.
Do you have his contact info?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know if he. Let me check.
Ruth, what kind of board members are we? So you said a comm person, right? But what else would you have in?
Yeah.
So in ISEV?
Yeah. So it's just doing. I mean, ISEF is bigger, obviously, because we're longer established. So ISEF has a president, treasurer, and secretary general, which form our executive board. And then we have 3 vice presidents for our 3 geographic regions. We have a director of standards. We have a director of international communications. We have the editor-in-chief of our journal. We have, and then I'm sure I've missed somebody. And then we have our 5 members at large.
Okay. It seems to me we don't need an editor or a treasurer yet.
No, and my suggestion might be that you have someone that you would call a chair in the first instance, somebody that you might call a membership secretary, somebody that you might call in charge of comms, and until you've got any money and you don't need a treasurer. But there you're kind of, I mean, to be honest, I think what I would do is start down by writing what are your aims, and then once you've got your aims, then from that you can follow out, well, what are the roles that need to be done to help us meet those initial aims, and then what people would fall into those roles. So
yeah. Rasha, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, well, I have two profiles with my name, but because one of them is not working, so
Yeah, I was
so
wondering.
sorry for, yeah, sorry for the confusion, but I just realized that my camera is not working, so I just like logged in with the mobile for sound and camera. So yeah. Yes, I'm so much endorsing the society thing because I think it would be, yeah, it would be great to have this. I think, yeah, we have been meeting for a lot, and I see the eye tracking technology is going very fast, and I was happy that we are as clinicians are catching up, you know, because I mean, when I even spoke, I'm an ophthalmologist to start with. So when I've been speaking, even with my colleagues, they can be using devices, but they're not deep into that the technology behind can be eye tracking, and that we can get more involved in that sense. And so that's one point. And the other thing is that I'm endorsing so much also the survey. I think it should be like a real survey for professionals, clinicians, as well as researchers, because like for me, I started researching with a university in Finland, and that was when actually it's the identity of the interactive technologies in kind of some universities. Under this name, they are researching eye tracking, and each one could be working with a certain clinician or a certain, like I know a group is working with eye tracking and Alzheimer, and another group I opened a line with low vision and ophthalmology. So I mean, it would be a very good idea to have the survey for clinicians and also approaching universities, hospital universities, and also the technology, you know, this interdisciplinary field, because this is my opinion, but I mean, if we go for a regular survey and getting all the ethical approvals, I think that would be good for us even to know now, because I think we will be amazed that there are a lot of people that we don't, they're not connected but are concerned.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like my humble opinion.
Yeah. So just to be clear, you think we should direct the survey more towards individuals within each group, as opposed to, say, universities as a whole and societies as a whole and that kind of thing? Yeah, well.
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, and because sometimes a person can speak on behalf of a society, and sometimes a person can even speak on you know, on his he can be working on individual level with a lot of, he can be personally involved and concerned as a clinician with the technology in another, whether in the country or like international or something. So yeah.
Matt?
Just another thought that occurred to me with relation to that is that, of course, if you survey the individual members, you're more likely to get people engaging with ISCET and getting involved as well. So that's another potential
that's a
benefit.
good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rasha, do you still have your hand up, or?
No, it's
Okay. No, that's fine. Steph, going back to questions about the board and roles and that kind of thing. I'd be willing to do something like the vice president for the America region for the time being, if that is helpful. But I do think that like a comm person is probably like a communications person is probably a priority, right? Because we need to start with getting the members in the door as a top priority. I'm going to arbitrarily point at Jorge and ask if that's something you could take on.
I don't know. I missed the other meeting, so I don't know exactly where we are with many things.
This is the first American meeting, so you didn't.
Oh, I see.
We had a couple meetings. They're recorded and posted on the website,
Okay.
and summarized in brief on the site also. But basically, most of the conversation has been identical across the meetings because we're introducing the topic to everyone and trying to decide on particular issues. You don't have to commit now.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't want to put undue pressure on anyone. But
Only if you want tenure, Jorge.
I know. I don't.
Probably just point out that if anyone's feeling like they haven't been involved in everything here, I mean, I think Ruth and myself are the only ones that have been to all the meetings so far. So don't feel like you're not involved. You are. If you're here now, you're heavily involved. So it'd be great to have as much input as we can from. Yeah, it's great that you're here.
I couldn't find Bo's email, but I thought he's friends on Facebook. I sent him off a message. I'll get it back to you as soon as I can.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Does anyone else have an opinion on what roles we need to get moving immediately?
I agree with Ruth on that the comms and membership secretary is an important thing at this point. I'm not quite sure what the difference between those roles is. But
I could volunteer. Yeah, I could volunteer a little bit. So when I say membership secretary, so it's kind of nitty gritty. So that's going to be about who's interested. We spend a small amount of money on membership software. You can buy these. It's like wild apricot, and it becomes your means of communicating with everybody. So in fact, it would be quite a small role initially, because until you've got members, there's nothing to manage. But initially, you would have what you could call contacts, which would be everybody that signed up to the JSC mail, everyone's email that have allowed to be included. Your comms person is going to be your person who is disseminating emails, notices about the meetings, who's running your Twitter account, who's created the LinkedIn page, who's watching for publications in the field that are felt to be relevant, tweeting about them. So it's just, it's suited to somebody not yet past their 40th birthday, I would say, but that's, depends on where you are. I mean, Matt, in my mind, it seems to me you've done a terrific job with communicating across this community so far, but I don't know if that's where your particular skill sets lie. It's somebody that's not necessarily setting the agenda, but is able to be abreast of everything that's going on and just fire. The more content you generate, then the more interest you will attract. And I don't mean in a sort of tabloid way. It's a bit different in science, obviously.
I'm going to say I've been struggling so far to find the time to kind of put loads and loads of messages out all the time. So it would be really good to have somebody who could kind of take that on more formally. I mean, I've sent them to message boards and so on, and but yeah, keeping it all up to date.
But you have been doing a great job of just managing keeping everything pulled together. So if you'd be interested in one of the larger roles,
I'm happy to be. As I say, I went from the outset with this. I think I've been keen to let this kind of evolve, and I try to stay in the background and just sort of, say that's why I was really keen that I'm not just chairing the meetings. There's different people chairing and so on. And obviously, if you're taking on the American thing, that's great. But yeah, no, I'd happy to do something like that, either the European Africa region or do the overall coordination for the time being. But I really don't mind. I'm trying not to.
I think you have your pick.
I'm happy I'm happy to sort of do the overall coordination for now. But I've been clear that this is not supposed to be something where it's like my project. And I think that I think like with the Methods Report project, it was important that everyone sees that this is a community effort and it's not about people trying to position themselves in any way like that. But I appreciate that it is necessary for us to have some kind of organization at this stage. And I like Ruth's suggestion of maybe having these be temporary roles for the time being until we've got a larger membership, and then we can make them more formalized by actual votes and so on. So that's fine. So yeah, I'm happy to be the kind of overall coordinator. I'm going to try and avoid the word chair or anything that sounds too grandiose, because I just, coordinating is fine.
If no one has objections, I'll do the America thing, but I kind of liked the vice president.
So I know that this is a small meeting compared to the numbers that came up elsewhere. So I guess you'd probably need to think about your list of roles, and you've got, a suggestion of Matt as your chair, coordinator, whatever, and Robert looking after the Americas for the time being, and giving the larger group an opportunity to comment on that, which is for transparency. But I would also strongly suggest that you look at who came along to the other meetings and who was happy to speak up and contribute. And I mean, I know Gemma Arblaster has already offered to do some work, but I'm too Europe-centric myself to see who's contributing from the other areas. So it would be about identifying the people and just approaching them directly and saying, we thought you'd be good at this role. Here's what's involved. Please, would you consider it?
I like
Because
that idea.
volunteer. That's just an absolute fact.
Yeah, and I think Steve's point from earlier is a good one about pointing to some early career researchers, and I'm sure there have been some in the other meetings that were participating and interested in, and that we could reach out to for those roles.
Yeah, when Susanna and I were very early researchers in our first or second year of being junior faculty, we led one of the conferences for ECVP, and it was actually quite a career boost. So, I mean, I think that, you know, while we can, putting some younger people in those roles and giving them a chance to shine and have some prominence, getting their name out there, will have an impact not just on society, but also in our society on the younger people. And I think it's just an idea. By the way, Bo Watson did respond already. He sent his emails in the chat. He sounds interested.
Great.
Great.
I can also just say that in the Australia and Asia region, Larry Abel has been very active so far, so I would potentially nominate him since he's been quite involved when we've had meetings in that direction. And I think I'll ask him whether he'd be happy to chair the next meeting as well, though I'm yet to hear back from him. Because it would be, I think the next one would be due to be in Australia.
Yeah. Jorge, if you could think about whether you're able to take on the role, and we'll communicate by email, and then once that's decided in either direction, Ruth is right, we should email the group as a whole and say that well, I and maybe Jorge have volunteered to do such and such role, and make sure other people are okay. Yes, Ruth, sorry.
Sorry, I wasn't interrupted waiting to.
Oh yeah.
I do.
Sorry, go ahead.
I do have to go very shortly, but I just wanted to add that your survey is going to be really interesting, because I think maybe much more so than ISEF, I think you're going to have multidisciplinary membership, and it might be a useful structure to think about having your board of representatives structured by, you might want an orthoptic representative, an ophthalmology representative, but those sorts of ideas are likely to go into fall out of your survey results and help inform it. But if you're identifying, I mean, I would have manufacturer's representative on it, frankly, and have that very short term and cycled, so that there's no undue influence and you can be seen to be impartial. But yeah, that will fall out the results from your survey.
Thank you for drafting a message, Steve. I just saw that in the chat. That looks good.
Great.
So
one question about this survey. So I arrived late.
Yeah, sorry.
The idea to get a sense of how eye tracking is used clinically around the world.
Yes, exactly.
And is it meant to be a paper potentially, or just for the purpose of
potentially a paper? Yeah.
Okay.
But the main function of it is to identify what the usage is, so that in the later steps of the society, we can focus on the regions that most urgently need guidelines, right? But yes, we saw that as a paper.
So we know what the low-hanging fruit are, right? Yeah. So we know what systems are being used. If we focused on those, we'll have an impact in society more quickly, right? That kind of thing. Just gives us an idea of what's going on.
I would say, yeah, there were two factors which we discussed previously, which would be important to deciding the priorities. And of course, one of them is, yeah, what are the things which are done most by clinicians around the world? But also then there would need to be some discussion as to, okay, which of these patient groups, even if they don't have as many clinicians working for them, more desperately require guidance, because it could actually have a more direct impact on their care, and also crucially the ability to move between test centers. So some conditions that, you know, people get tested once and that's it. So there are other factors that will feed into that decision. But this is obviously a very important one. And I think it also helps us to understand, well, it helps us to gather more membership as well, understand if we're missing any disciplines. We haven't come up with a formal list of clinical disciplines yet, although we've had a lot of, we've compiled some list of people who've been present at the meetings, but there may be other disciplines that we simply haven't gotten involved in. And then, of course, at some point, there will need to be a decision as to, does ISCET intend to represent all of those disciplines, or is that not appropriate? In some cases, at the moment, the definition is simply if you consider yourself a clinician and you use an eye tracker, then ISCET represents you. But yeah.
Is there a model for another type of measurement? I don't know, like EKGs or some MRI tests or
Ruth was
something?
just talking about how they did a similar thing with ERGs.
Okay.
You have a society for
Yes.
ERGs, and they kind of went through the same process, and they can't, they had to navigate the minefield of dealing with what industry already had available and how what they were actually going to be able to get clinicians to do, because clinicians want to use the turnkey system that they can buy and then use. And something I thought that was very helpful that she said is it needs to have a code and they need to get paid for the test. So the more we can direct it towards that from the beginning with that, or at least keeping that kind of thing in mind, the more it's going to be, integrated quickly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
So the remaining things on the agenda, I think we're not going to go into too much because of the turnout today. But one of the things we wanted to do was formalize the mission statement of the society. So far there were 3 aims proposed. Rasha, sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So we agreed that the society will only include the clinicians. So if someone researching and not clinician, or if someone is deeply involved in this interdisciplinary area, they will not be able to be members.
Shall I take that?
Yeah, I think.
Yes. So no, we've been widely encouraging researchers and manufacturers to be involved as well. In particular, a lot of the things that we'll need standardizing are quite technical aspects. Maybe it could be to do with the low pass filtering that you do for your data and so on. And there is some really good expertise in various parts of Europe, at least, that work with those kind of technical aspects of eye tracking, which we would probably be able to draw upon. And I know for ISEV, which is the electrophysiology of vision group, that they rely quite heavily on that technical expertise from the research domain to inform the clinical side of things. So at least to my mind, and at least what we've published on the website so far, is it's open to anyone with an interest in clinical eye tracking, but you could be a researcher and be involved.
Great, because that's what I wanted, but I misunderstood at the end. So thank you for clarifying. Yes, yes, that will be, better for the society. So anyone with interest would be in, right?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us here are not clinicians, and so we would have been kicking ourselves out of the group.
No, but that's the perfect thing, because like I see everyone is on his own, which is not the proper thing. This has to be like with anyone who's interested in the topic. I feel that's
Well, I know for me as I'm early career, like I have an interest in the clinical things, and so seeing that guidelines be established is fairly important to me. But yeah, I'm not as involved, and certainly I'm not a clinician in and of myself. Mario, you had your hand raised.
Yes, on this topic, how is industrial participation regulated, considering that the society plans to discuss about guidelines, and participation of industry is very interesting from many points of view, but especially when discussing guidelines can introduce a significant risk of bias?
That's a good point, because we don't want something like we end up with a guideline that says that the one company's test is the test to use for everything, right?
At the same time, it's a valuable presence, that of industry.
Yeah.
And I don't know, another complicated aspect here is FBA. And I don't know how to tie it into it, because the manufacturers will have some particular box that they sell that it's FDA approved for something. and they are not going to be willing to make any change
Right.
that would break that.
That's a very good point.
I wonder if we can get the FDA approved and the FDA interested in participating. Like there might be an officer at the FDA who might actually be willing to participate in the conference, because one of our goals is to actually, one of our initiatives is to drive these things towards the clinic, because that's how these things are going to have the biggest impact in clinical vision. Then I think having the FDA on board from the beginning, saying that's a non-starter, that'll work, that kind of thing would be useful.
Yes,
Identifying which companies have already something FDA approved versus the ones that don't. Like
Exactly.
iLink, and the ones we use in labs, they don't have anything and they haven't even tried. But then there are these other companies that they do have those FDA approved devices.
I think the participation of regulatory bodies is pretty much a double-edged sword, exactly like industry. It can bring absolutely invaluable information, so it's precious. At the same time, imagine having here a representative from FDA and a representative from the C area regulatory. It's effectively starting a trade war if you start having them putting too much pulling into the definition of guidelines. So
they have their own guidelines about that, though, right? Don't you think? I mean, I assume that they're aware of those kinds of issues.
Absolutely, but these trade wars do exist.
Yeah.
Saying, right, I want things to be qualified this way simply because at that point it's easier to qualify them in the US than it is in the European Union or similar things, or in Russia. And yet at the same time, they bring absolutely precious information. So I think some form of way of handling conflicts of interest is necessary. And that's the whole point. It's not about industry or regulatory bodies. It's the general aspect of conflicts of interest.
Yeah, I think we might want to make that one of the major agenda points for the next meeting, because I think that is going to take some substantial amount of discussion, right? Matt, is that what you were going to say, or?
Yeah, I was just saying that, yeah, how we handle conflicts of interest. I think we can probably look to ISCET again, because they will have been, obviously there are various manufacturers of similar equipment, and so far they've proved a very helpful model for us, and Ruth's been very, very helpful in what she's been suggesting. So yes, I'll put that as an agenda item for the next meeting.
Good. So stepping back for a moment, one of the things we were hoping to do was formalize the mission statement, which I know here we haven't discussed in the Americas. But there were currently 3 aims proposed. One was to represent the clinical eye tracking sector. Another was to maintain and develop guidelines and standards. And third, to maintain reference data sets. I don't know how everyone here feels about those, or if there's any additional aim we should be proposing to the other parts of the society.
I'm not processing those, Robert. Could you put them in the
Yep. Yeah, I'll put them in the chat.
I have recently also put them on the about. Okay, you got the about page.
Yeah.
Same thing.
I had it in front of me. And we also, I think this will be just a quick aside. We wanted to formalize the existence of committees for each of the 3 regions we were talking about. Europe and Africa, Asia and Australia, and the Americas, North, South, Central. I think that has, Ari?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that your what you just put in the chat, the goals,
yeah.
I think it's not only 3 goals, but I think it's in that order. Meaning, until we have guidelines and standards, you can't really have a reference data set, because you have no idea how people are collecting.
Yeah.
So I think it's really in, and to represent, that could come at that sort of separate parallel. But I think the first thing is what was said already at the first meeting, or what we've been saying here, is this idea of guidelines and standards. Because clinicians seem to be using eye movement now that eye movement has become much cheaper. You can do it on your smartphone,
Right.
People using it for all kinds of things, and there's no standardization.
Yeah,
I
for
wonder if I think that that's something that's probably not true in the ERG field, but is going to be true here. Is the biggest player is not clinical, and it's not going to be. It's going to be consumer electronics. So I really think that putting in number two, clinical and consumer eye tracking sectors would be wise. I know the name's already been set with IS1CET, but it might be that this is going to be a unique position, or this society will be unique in that it's going to have a very large ear in consumer electronics, listening to what we're doing, compared to other things that are solely clinically relevant or research relevant. So I think that Ari's point that all our phones track our eyes right now, and most people don't even realize it. And there are advanced eye tracking systems coming out in these augmented headsets that are potentially game changing for research as well as clinicians. I think
Yeah.
maybe
I suspect we may want to focus on specifically the clinical applications within the consumer market also, as opposed to just very broadly, like we want to know how people are like, we don't need these guidelines to extend to, AR video games if they're not clinical in any. Yeah. Okay.
I just meant that the hardware is going to be the hardware for each of these things, right?
Yeah.
So, and perhaps the filtering and all of these types of things. And one imagines that once there are commercial tests available that are clinical for measuring ocular motor signatures for various things, that these companies are all going to want to understand what the sampling rates and the accuracies and all of these things necessary in their eye trackers are, in order to provide those tests for clinical use or in whatever use, right? So I agree that guidelines and standards should be set for the clinical side of things,
Right.
but we need to represent
The consumer view.
consumer electronics are being used for clinical use.
Does is everyone here in agreement there that we think that should be a restatement of the aim? Matt, what are you?
So yeah, I can see how if consumer products end up getting used, then we would need to make sure that they were suitable for purpose. Is that what you're suggesting, really? That it's still, we're not deviating away from clinical, but we're saying that where those devices are used. So one of the things which was discussed in an earlier meeting was that we wouldn't want to try and limit the ability to do these tests to any one piece of machinery, and that it would basically set a minimum set of standards for the machinery. There might be a minimum sampling rate for certain types of eye tracking tests. Of course, it's going to depend on what you're doing. And so I don't see that needs to necessarily talk about consumer necessarily. So long as a device meets the requirement to do a clinical test, I don't see how whether or not it's a consumer, focused product is relevant. But maybe I've misunderstood. But yeah.
I mean, I feel like there's a lot of sort of pseudo clinical usages being developed in the consumer end, and I don't know how much we want to weigh in on that also, because that's going to be a very different sort of area, right?
Yeah, I think also we spoke about it. We're not wanting to be a kind of regulatory body, or
Right.
One of the other things that was mentioned in the last meeting is we don't want to try and get involved in signing people off as competent, because that's just way beyond the remit of, or at least not the remit of capacity of being able to do that. It was more about saying, hey, these are the optimum standards for being able to undertake these tests, and also being clear that it's not a dictatorial thing. We're not saying that if somebody does things a slightly different way, they're doing it wrong. It's just saying that if you're new to the field, or if all other things are equal, then why don't you do 10-degree saccade steps, for example, or whatever it might be. So it's about having a set of reasonable defaults rather than trying to coerce anyone. But maybe in the future that remit will expand, and I guess we'll see where it goes.
Does anyone else have any comments or questions about what we've talked about so far? Or any other business that we should, oh, Rasha, yeah.
Well, I just have one thing, because you have mentioned that quickly, that when you spoke about AR. So I think eye tracking now is also integrated in virtual reality and extended reality devices, and these are things that we will have to use. And I've been even for the technology people and all the guidelines for this new technology is still actually it's not even there. They're updating, especially with the what happened quickly with the AI and so they are kind of still updating and doing some regulations in Europe regarding that. So I think we should also mention like eye tracking with the other complex or maybe interactive things. I mean, it would be also important if we're putting some standards or some guidelines that we will also mention these things, because yeah, some people would only use the eye tracking that is integrated in the VR headsets or XR headsets.
Yeah, I think we're planning to be very broad in what hardware we're considering. And yeah, we should specifically mention that domain.
Maybe just having guidelines that certain types of information about whatever hardware it is you're using be made available from the manufacturer. Like maybe we absolutely need to know, for example, that certain filters are being used, because that could skew clinical results if a filter was applied that you didn't know about, right? So that kind of thing, maybe that's maybe that's where, you know, the rubber meets the road with the whomever's providing the hardware, whether it's a consumer product or whether it's a dedicated clinical manufacturer, that certain types of things they might otherwise have kept proprietary, we would suggest have to be provided so that tests can be interpreted properly.
I mean, depending upon if you're using like fixations or saccades or whatever, right? There are different ways to parse these things even. Like sometimes they're using a distance metric, other times they're using velocity and acceleration and whatever else, right? So all of those things would absolutely affect any of the things that you're talking about here.
Yeah.
Or deep learning as well. Like
Yes.
more
Yeah.
and more, there is
Yeah.
gonna be a black box that is trained to give you eye position, and another black box that is trained to give you the average saccade velocity or something. And there may not be anything in between to really inspect. So
I wonder if there's like a guideline that eye trackers used for clinical tests need to be able to provide the raw data, right? And then they can draw any analyses they want and provide that too. But if the raw unfiltered data or filtered in only certain ways are provided to the who's ever using the headset, then they can know, you know, they can then apply their own filters or whatever for whatever it is clinical test they want to use. I don't know. Maybe that's something.
Matt,
Yeah, but-
Matt, can you remind me, in the previous papers from the minimal reporting group, I think we fell short of going that far and saying they had to get rid of any proprietary black box stuff, right?
Yeah, that was more, obviously that was just to do with reporting research, but it was saying that you have to report certain things. And so if there is an eye tracker that doesn't tell you what frequency it's running at, then that basically means they're out of the running for having met those minimum standards for reporting.
Yeah. I assume we'll be at least drawing on the list of minimals that we came up with there as possible starting places for clinical.
Yes, yeah, and that was an important kind of foundation to what this is. We said that one of the very first questions that I asked at a meeting about 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been, was do we need these clinical standards? And the feeling in the room at the time, it was a conference I was at, was that, well, we don't even know right now what people are doing in their research. So how can we start to define standards until we know what's actually being done, because people aren't reporting appropriately? So that was the purpose of that. I think with regards to, we're talking about all these different types of technologies and how they do things. I think at least with ISCET, they don't worry too much about how things are implemented. It's really, you set these minimum standards. You say this is what's required to get a decent data set that can then be replicated in different places if they all do the same minimums. And then it's up to the manufacturer to create an ISCET compliant protocol. Their system might not always work with a particular filtering method. They can use whatever fixation filter they want, but if they have a setting on there saying if you push this button, you'll be using the ISCET compliant standard, then they can, as long as someone can verify that is indeed ISCET compliant, then I guess they can still keep their black boxes covered.
That's fair.
But it means we don't worry too much about about dictating technology or worrying about individual manufacturers. You just say, here's the standard, you meet it or you don't.
So I think sorry, Rasha.
Just what I wanted to highlight is maybe it's about the data and the privacy of the data when it comes that we will use, for example, an XR device for collecting our medical data. This is the things that are still even a little bit where the guidelines are not that clear. And I think even Apple, when they were advertising their new VR XR headset, they have mentioned this, that even the developers in the headquarters, they will not be seeing the data, and that it will be that confidential, which actually would be good for our medical field. But I mean, maybe if we are, because we said that we will see the extent of the company involvement. It's nice to involve them, and it's nice to have a kind of a consensus and to see how we will be managing the medical data issue. But yeah.
I think we're gonna finish up, unless anyone had any pressing comments or questions. So just to make sure we're on the same page here, Jorge, you have to make a decision and get back to us. You can email me or Matt. And then we're going to ask the other groups whether they approve of those position nominations and start electing people in the other groups. We also are going to start reaching out to additional people, and we have a few outlets in mind for that. And then in the next meeting, one of the things we're going to talk about is how we should have industry and FDA type people involved in the process, and what, if any, limits we're going to place in that kind of. Did I miss anything critical there?
Should just be regulatory in general, because we went European regulatory.
Yes. Thank you.
Right, but if I can just say, I think we have people from a lot of different places here. I think you were right what you said early on. We should make contact with clinicians, local clinicians, and see what they're using now, which iMovers are in clinical use.
Yeah. Well,
and if they have any standards, how they do it, meaning I think the survey is really important.
Yes. I completely
also
agree.
tag funding agencies, right? Because they're going to know all the people who are developing, these tests and doing the research, but also they're going to have a stake in being able to tell us. They've already done a lot of research on what's going to be impactful and necessary to find out. So getting people from the NEI and INDS and funding agencies in Europe who fund vision and ocular motor integrative research.
That's a good point. Okay. Any last? Sorry. Go ahead.
With funding agencies, of course, those will be primarily research based, but would you envisage that we would be asking them, because of course those things are translating into clinical devices? Is that the...
In the U.S., most of the funding is actually run by clinical people. I mean, in a sense, right? So they're the NIH is, each of the institutes is dedicated to a body part. In medicine, they're there to design medicine. Now, they fund a lot of basic research too, but their primary interest, as far as the public is concerned, is to cure disease. So my feeling is that they've already solved a lot of the thinking about what we've been talking about today in terms of targeting their research goals or their funding goals in a similar way that we've been talking about, trying to develop our initiatives for ISCET as well.
Right. Just so I've got this down correctly for an action point, then would you suggest that those funding agencies would be contacted as part of the survey, or would we just be extending? Okay, okay.
Basically, call for information and what they'd like to see in this, and
Got it.
invite them to participate in as members of the society in the same way that industry is being invited. Right? We need their voice. And, they can come in and they're going to know a lot of things that these other groups might not know, or at least they span more than one.
Great.
I'm going to share one more time in the chat a link to the ideas document for the survey. If anyone has time later and can take a look and add any disciplines they can think of that aren't currently on the list to be included in the survey, that would be helpful.
Great. And just a reminder, everyone can post to that email list group, by the way, so you're all able to contribute there. It's not just messages from me.
Great. So I think we're going to end it here. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And I'll see at least some of you at the next meeting.
Great.
All right.
And thank you, Robert and Matt,